Hi everyone. Today we are doing some more contextualizing work with Between the World and Me. So just as last week we read Malcolm X to kind of situate ourselves in terms of the influences on Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, this week we're going to think about the literary influences on this book partly, but mostly, we're going to kind of get deeper into the way in which Between the World and Me is a book that really investigates the relevance of history um, on the self-perception of Ta-Nehisi Coates, and I think also from his perspective on the Black community as such. So part of the way that we're going to kind of well, we're going to think about the simplicity of kind of starting an investigation of a book simply by thinking about the relevance of its title, and B, how that kind of entry point can bring about a much more kind of complex understanding of the book. So it's both about kind of finding our way into an effective reading methodology and also a method for understanding some of the more complex features of the book. So it's a practice of analysis as well. So Ta-Nehisi Coates titles his book Between the World and Me, but that title is borrowed. It's borrowed from the great author Richard Wright, um, who also writes a poem Between the World and Me, which you're reading for this week. You're reading and analyzing for this week. So the most important thing that um, you can kind of take with you into that reading is to know that the poem is about lynching. Once you understand that this is a poem about lynching, then you can begin to unpack some of the language of that poem, and kind of experience it apart from just this, the basic what is this text about, and thinking about the kind of more nuanced aspects of language that work in poetic meaning. So what you see on the screen is a kind of, I've linked this on the homework, but it's basically an overview of lynching. It's a definition so that you can understand what lynching is. And I'm going to read the first two, the second and third paragraphs, so that we can kind of get into a clear understanding of the horrors of lynching before we talk a little bit about the poem and its link to the book. So lynching emerged. So lynching is something that happens after the end of slavery and the premature end of Reconstruction. So this is, roughly early part of the 19th century. So lynching emerged as a vicious tool of racial control in the South after the Civil War, as a way to reestablish white supremacy and suppress Black civil rights. At the end of the 19th century, Southern lynch mobs targeted and terrorized African Americans with impunity. Lynching of African Americans was terrorism, a widely supported phenomenon used to enforce racial subordination and segregation. Lynchings were violent and public events that traumatized Black people throughout the country and were largely tolerated by state and federal officials. This was not frontier justice carried out by a few marginalized vigilantes or extremists. Instead, many African Americans who were never accused of any crime were tortured and murdered in front of picnicking spectators, including elected officials and prominent citizens, for bumping into a white person or wearing their military uniforms after World War I, or not using the appropriate title when addressing a white person. People who participated in lynchings were celebrated and acted with impunity, purchasing victims' body parts as souvenirs and posing for photographs with hanging corpses to mail to loved ones as postcards. So when you read about this and you understand how serious it is, there were more than 4,000 people documented as having been lynched in this country. Um, then you begin to ask yourself, okay, what does it mean to Coates for me to confront this history before I have actually even picked up the book? It means that he wants us to have a profound experience of a particular kind of history in this country. So the poem, Between the World and Me, is a lengthy poem. Um, First of all, it's a poem about lynching, but it's also a poem about lynching from the perspective of an I, the speaker of the poem, who himself is a victim of lynching. So we're basically reading the poem of a ghost. And once we understand that, then we can look at the epigraph that opens this book, which draws from the poem. And the epigraph is the following, and I'm going to read that. And one morning while in the woods, I stumbled suddenly upon the thing, stumbled upon it in a grassy clearing, guarded by scaly oaks and elms, and the sooty details of the scene rose, thrusting themselves between the world and me. So what does this essentially mean? Um, Coates takes the first stanza of the poem and uh, is asking us to think about what is this thing standing. There's something between the world and me, and it is the scene of a lynching. So, what does it mean for this scene to be an obstacle between the speaker, the person who is ostensibly an I, a me, a person with an identity? What does it mean for there to be this obstacle between that person and the world? And that obstacle here is this gruesome history. So, in many ways, Between the World and Me is a book that explores uh, the terrible legacies of racism in this country, not simply through the act of lynching, but also the entirety of 350 years of racism. So that means the history of slavery, with all of its terrors, and the history of segregation, a history that part of which involves lynching. So it's not just about uh, separating whites from blacks at the lunch counter. It's about murder. And Coates wants us always to keep that in front and center as we're moving through this really profound account of his own personal experiences as an African American living in Baltimore for the major part of his childhood, for the entirety of his childhood, and then moving on to um, New York. So we do see him travel a bit, but basically, you know, throughout his account of his experience, he's always very, very aware of history. Um, and it's something that, in the context of this book, he's also attempting to impress upon his readers the importance of history, but also the haunting of history. History is something which actually, in some ways, prevents him um, from having a kind of experience of the present that other people might enjoy, because, right, he's always thinking about, he's not just always thinking about what has happened historically, but he's seeing its impact on him. So history is this kind of haunting. And that's really in large part why he titles the book Between the World and Me, and also why he opens the book with this poem.